Hey, Leadville Racers, how are you? My name is Mike Iddings, and I'm a 28-time Leadville finisher, and I'm doing the YouTube channel Getmybuckle. And today's guest is quite the accomplished cyclist. I'm not even going to get into his accomplishments. There's too many to list. But tonight is Lachlan Morton. And Lachlan, thanks for being here. Appreciate you taking the time out of your day.
Yeah, good.
And
Thank you for
would
having
like
me.
to just talk a little bit about Leadville and your experience and your journey and your race day. And so
Yeah,
again,
happy to chat about it. It's always one of the most special, races of the year. So yeah, I've finished it I think four times now, something like that. One DNF. So I'm happy to.
DNF.
Yeah, first time as a DNF. So I'm happy to share my learnings, I guess.
Nice. So with all the other awesome accomplishments in cycling that you've, done, what made you decide I want to do Leadville?
So the first time I did it was really late decision in the piece. I won Tour of Utah in 2016, and then basically drove back home. And the following weekend, Leadville was on, and I had at that point was a pure road bike rider, and I thought, like I'm going well, like the demands at Utah should be similar to uh, Leadville, and so I borrowed a mountain bike and just went and did it, and it was like, you know, basically had all the disasters that could happen before Twin Lakes, and I only made it to Twin Lakes on the way out. Like I hadn't looked at the course, hadn't done anything, and basically like I flattered before, like basically as soon as we got off road, I flattered and then chased back, and then tore a sidewall coming into Twin Lakes, and that was day done for me. So that was very much a false start, but got what I deserved in terms of I didn't do any homework, and I hadn't ridden a mountain bike, so like the flats I had, knowing what I know now, were totally, of my own fault. So I had I almost like disregard that as like an attempt, but it was an attempt, it was a failed attempt. But my first real go at it was 2019, and
Wow.
that was my first year with EF, and we were kind of doing, like, I was racing a road calendar, but then we had a separate alternative calendar, which was basically we raced Unbound. I did an ultra the month before, and then Leadville, I think, was our third kind of event that we targeted. And Leadville's one that's like, it had captured my imagination because it's such a unique race. I mean, I think Leadville's a unique place for starters, and I've spent a lot of time up in Summit County, close by, training, as a junior. And I would always kind of go to Breckenridge area to prepare for like big races. So I'd ridden through Leadville a number of times, and then kind of wanted to see what it was all about. It was on my radar from when Lance and Levi and all that started competing, and it was sort of this unique overlap of like uh half suits a road racer, half suits a mountain biker, and also just an epic day out in the mountains. So I was like, all right, I want to go see what this is about. And that was, I hadn't been riding a mountain bike very long at all at that point. Like after the first Leadville experience, I didn't race mountain bikes. And then the start of that year, I jumped in a few mountain bikes. At that point, I was living in Girona, in Spain, and so I jumped into a few small races there, like local races, within the back of my head, like I need to build experience for August. So I wasn't doing a ton on the mountain bike at that point, but I definitely was more experienced than the first time around. Again, knowing what I know now, I had no idea how to ride a mountain bike, but at least I was kind of like, familiar with how the bike felt riding off road at somewhat speed. And yeah, it basically that year, Leadville, I think, was on the Saturday, and then Tour of Utah started on the Monday. So I basically prepared for the Tour of Utah, and Leadville was kind of like, it's a similar demand in terms of you're racing at high altitude, and you need to be able to push yourself sort of up to 6 hours, and that was like the extent of my preparation. I did a little bit of homework in that I went and rode the course, well, sections of the course. I rode sort of the first out and back, the bottom of Powerline, and then one day I went out and my plan was to do 2 climbs of Columbine, and I got to the top and I had a bunch of gear because I was worried how it was going to be cold. And I got up there and I was like, all right, I'm going to go down and come up fast. So I dropped I had like a backpack full of clothes and food and stuff, and I left it up at the top and dropped back down. And by the time I got halfway back up the next time, this lightning storm had rolled in, and I couldn't get up there. I couldn't get above the tree line because there was so much lightning. So I had to leave my backpack overnight and come back and grab it another time. So I got an extra lap. But I was familiar with the course at least. And then yeah, the way the race unfolded, like it went well in terms of, I think I finished second or third. No, I was third. I finished third. But I definitely didn't get the fueling or pacing right, and learnt a lot through that experience. And basically on Powerline, it came down to Howard Grotz and I, and then halfway up Powerline, I ran out of legs, and he watched the race right away, and then I was pretty much running on empty then, and I think Quinn Simmons caught me, but yeah, it's a tough one because the altitude, basically you end up your perceived effort and the actual effort your body is putting out, there's a disconnect. So you think you're riding, in zone 3, for example, but your heart rate's pinned close to the threshold. So the energy expenditure over the course of a day is a lot higher than you think it is. So if you fuel for it thinking it's a normal bike race, you're already behind. So that was like the biggest lesson I learned that time around. And also a little bit with like bike setup. I learned that like I started to use a dropper after that, which definitely helped me a lot. And I knew that I'd wasted a lot of energy on the more technical sections that time around, and that like if I was going to have a proper crack at it, I would need to be more proficient in the technical sections, because it's
Up or down?
yeah, I mean, like a lot of people look at that race and they say, you know, it's like a gravel race, for example. Which true, you could go and ride that course on a gravel bike. Like you could get around fine. But what people don't realize is that, all right, there's 75% of the course, say distance wise, that a gravel bike may be quicker, but the race happens in the other 25%. And that's where you want to be on a full suspension bike, right? So in the end, you sort of have to find like a middle ground as to what you run, which is a challenge. And essentially, the more proficient you are and technically skilled you are, the more aggressive you can run your setup. So the next time around, I think I'm trying to think exactly what year that was. I think I skipped a year and then came back, and I was coming off the back of an ultra. So I took a different approach in that I was trying to recover from an ultra and get my body ready. And I kind of mentally was like too fried to do intervals and that kind of thing. So I just spent like 3 weeks riding up at high altitude on my mountain bike, riding single track, and honing in my skills. And then, trying to do that. The only real efforts I did were all kind of high elevation efforts to get the body used to it. Like there is adaptation there, but two, like understanding the feeling is a big part of it, because like basically all the big races I've ever won on the road or off-road have been at high elevation, and it never feels good. Like even if you're winning and you're putting minutes into people, it still feels like a disaster. And understanding that that's normal is a big part of it, So I think like you quickly get that disconnect. And I think it's easy to look at people at the front of the race and go, oh, they're doing it easy. But in reality, everyone's hanging on by a thread, And it's like
Hard
that.
to believe from us normal people.
Right. I mean, and it's an age-old saying that, like you don't it never feels easy, as you just go faster. And it's very true. Like a good race at Leadville and a bad race at Leadville, physically they feel the same. It's just the time it takes is kind of the only difference. So yeah, next time around it went well. Unfortunately, it was the first time Keegan showed up, and he rode away from me at the exact same spot that Howard rode away from me. And then I finished second. And yeah, I've been trying to go back and win it ever since, but he's proven to be an absolute master of that course. So
Is he good?
I mean, I enjoy it. It's not a race to be conquered, it's just to be experienced, That's kind of what I've realized. And you kind of show up and put your hat in the ring, and sometimes it goes your way and other times it doesn't. And the last 2 times I've showed up more prepared than ever, and I've just had bad luck. And that happens, But since that first time, I've never DNF'd it, because I've had flats and whatever, but it's such a long day. You can come back into it, and things can go sideways that weren't in the plan, and you feel like your day's falling apart. But it's such a long effort that you can always turn things around and salvage something from it. And there's even something to just be gained from sticking it out, back to Leadville from Twin Lakes, because that race is just essentially it's a slow death, and everyone dies somewhere between Twin Lakes and Leadville, and you hope it's after the power line, but more or less, like more times than not, it's at the bottom of the power line, and then everyone's just on their hands and knees trying to get back. It turns from being full race mode to like, oh God, how am I going to get there? And I think everyone shares that experience, which is the beauty of it. If you could do it in 6 hours, or you could do it, over 12, and go out there and have a chat with someone and be like, oh yeah, like that hill or that section of the course, because it hurts the same way. And in a lot of ways, I have more respect for people who take longer, because that kind of that suffering, you're in it for a very long time. So I think yeah, again, I've raced it a number of times, and I don't know if you can ever execute it perfectly, even though I think, like, if you look at last year, Keegan had as close to a perfect ride as you could hope to have, but I'm sure he has a number of things in the back of his head that he knows he could, do better or execute on the next time around. So
Really?
yeah, it's definitely one that gets under your skin, and you're always thinking of how you could prepare better. But in my opinion, the biggest demands of finishing the race come down to the duration. All right, it's like it's a long day out, so essentially you need to have an endurance base that's capable of continuing for 6 to 12 hours. Like that's number one. And I think that's probably the easiest. Well, when I say easiest, it's the hardest because it just requires consistency. And I think like the second you're going to do that race, you need to be like, all right, I need to work my endurance base, and anyone can do that. Obviously, everyone has different time constraints and whatever, but basically, it just comes down to like showing up every day and doing some sort of riding.
Time on the bike.
Time on the bike, and you don't. I think like people can get carried away with thinking they need to have done the race distance before, which I think it can help if you have that ability and time to go out and do some of those longer rides. That helps, but consistency trumps those big one-off days every time. So if you're consistent in your training and continuously accumulating volume, I think that's like priority number one. Like that's going to get you out of most situations. And then you get to like the specific demands of the course, right? So in the end, it is a mountain bike race. You don't have to be a mountain bike racer to finish Leadville, but you do want to have enough skills and ability to, one, be able to enjoy the technical parts, because it always sucks if you're like just nursing your way down and totally gripped and can't enjoy the technical sections and you're stressed about it. So I think like building some sort of technical skill base, definitely, it's not a requirement to finish the course, but it's going to help you do it a lot quicker and help you have a lot more fun. So
probably be safer too.
safer, yeah. And like going back to my first time, the reason I didn't keep air in the tires had nothing to do with the tires I was using. It was because I didn't know what I was doing on a mountain bike, and couldn't
line choice.
Yeah, couldn't identify which lines to use, couldn't identify the right speed, and couldn't position my body in a way where I could, ease the bike over stuff that I didn't need to hit. So all of those things are important. Again, not a requirement, but definitely is specific to that race. And if you're going to invest the time and money in going to the race, you might as well get on the mountain bike at least once a week. And the way I went about learning mountain bike riding was I found a local group of mountain bike riders who were better than I was, but a group of riders that weren't, they understood my ability and they were never going to put me in a situation that was dangerous, but they constantly pushed my ability. And I basically showed up every week with this group of Catalan bike riders who we could barely communicate, but we shared the language of cycling, and that helped me progress. And anything that I couldn't ride on the Saturday morning ride with those guys, I would find time to go out during the week and ride it, and at that point, my like strategy was, if I couldn't ride anything on a mountain bike ride, I would try it 3 times. And then if I couldn't do it after 3 times, I was like, all right, move on. But I definitely had to like the roadie mentality, I was like wanted to go out and do a loop, you know. So if I had to step off, I was like, all right, now get up the hill and do whatever, instead of being like, okay, I'm going to get more out of just sessioning this one particular feature than I am riding something I can ride already. So that was how I went about like building skill. And I think it definitely, like, I progressed quickly, but um it took like specific dedication to that, you know. And so anytime I showed up to do a mountain bike ride, I was like, this is not about me building my fitness. This is about me building my skills. So like that was the mindset. And then the next obvious one is like the altitude, which is, I think, like the hardest specific feature of Leadville. That's the thing that makes it different than any other 100-mile race. You know, it's like the fact that most of the race takes place above 10,000 feet, which is very uncomfortable. And then, you know, obviously at the extreme points of the course, what are you at top of Columbine? Over 12,000,
Oh yeah,
close
like
to 13. Yeah. And that's a process of like, that's very rider specific in terms of, one, how they adapt to altitude, but two, basically it's a time contingent thing. So if you have the ability and the time and the resources to go and dedicate a month's worth of training at altitude, that's ideal, you know. But like, unless you're a professional athlete, that's incredibly difficult to achieve, right? Most people are already like at their limit with being able to get there on the weekend. So like that, if you can do that in an ideal world and have a month at altitude, great, you know. But if you can't, I think maximizing any time you can have helps, you know, because the body, there's a lot of adaptations that do happen pretty quickly. But the biggest thing is understanding how it feels and adjusting your pacing and your nutrition around that. Because it's just, the engine revs harder, you know. And like, if I can go and do like, let's say I normally do a threshold effort at 360 watts, for example. I know that if I'm going to go do a threshold interval at 10,000 feet, I'm going to bump that back by at least 10%, you know, because like your body just can't cope with it. And for some people it might be 20%. Like 10% is probably where you get to once you are a little bit acclimatized. So you can never hit those same numbers. Or like, you know, if you look at your heart rate, it's going to be sky high. But that's probably a better indicator of what your body's actually doing, even if it feels like you're going very slowly. And like, that is the key to that race. And in terms of like preparation, if you can get that time at altitude, that's great. If you can't, just make sure on race day you account for that altitude from the start, because you get so caught up in the race. There's so much excitement. You know, there's thousands of bike riders. They shoot the shotgun. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on at the beginning that gets you all riled up, and you basically let out of the pen and you just want to rip. And because you're so amped up, you can go. And then once it thins out and gets quiet and you're sort of an hour and a half in and you start to feel the legs and you realize you're like, oh, I might have done something bad here.
right.
So yeah, like keep a lid on it. And the biggest factor of performing at altitude, if you're looking at from a race perspective, is to minimize any time you're above threshold. So if you're going into that red, it's really hard to come back. It's not like normal where you can kind of go into the red, and then if it comes back for a few minutes, you can sort of clear the lactate and be back to base. It doesn't work like that. Essentially, if you go into the red, you almost need to stop pedaling before you can really clear any kind of lactate. So understanding where that line is and really never going over it. And
Wow.
if you are going over it, you're doing it for a reason. You might be have come off the bottom of the descent at power line. You're like, okay, if I make a 30-second effort here, I'm going to get into a group, and then I'm going to be in that group all the way to Twin Lakes, right?
Right.
It's a fast section of the course. Then you could say, all right, that's worth this, burning this one match. But you got to know in the back of your head, you're like, I've got 3 or maybe 4 of these matches to burn the whole day. So like you have to be very strategic at when you use them. And I'm guilty of getting caught up in the race and burning those matches too quickly, because I mean, at the end of the day, if you're a bike racer, it's hard to be conscious of that in the moment. But you really need to be like, I think if you go in like drilling that conservative mentality, you're probably going to come up to a good spot in terms of like you'll get carried away at some points. But if you just kind of in the back of your head, you're always like, hey, I've still got to come all the way back the same way. And when I come back, it's going to hurt twice as much. So just like keep a lid on it. Like
Right. That nasty power line descent is even nastier climb coming home.
oh yeah. Oh yeah. You pay with interest on the way back for sure. So I'd say like in terms of preparing for Leadville, they're the biggest things. And then like going hand in hand with the altitude is fueling. Because as I said, the engine revs harder. Normally for this a similar amount of effort, your heart rate's going to be 10 to 15 beats higher. And that's the true indication of how hard your body's working. And when it's up higher there, you're going through a lot of carbohydrates. Your body's a lot less efficient. And unless you're on top of putting those carbohydrates back in, you're going to run empty at some point. And getting an understanding of how much you can stomach essentially is key to it, because you can never put in enough in a race like that because your body just works too hard. So there's always going to be a point that you kind of dwindling in terms of like your glycogen stores or the carbohydrates that your body has left. Essentially, you're trying to prolong how long that takes.
Right.
And in an ideal world, you're back over power line and that's somewhat downhill, except for the drag back into town. So for me, my go-to now, having done it a few times, is I rely very heavily on like liquid carbohydrates, because again, it's so hard to breathe, let alone eat at that altitude. And I find that racing in altitude, you don't have a strong appetite. You don't feel hungry. You just suddenly run out. So I just try and like constantly be drinking. And for that race, I'm aiming at like a minimum of 110 grams of carbohydrates an hour. And that's coming primarily from like the fluid I'm taking in, as well as gels. So I kind of basically run liquid kind of intake for that whole race. And the bottles I take, I'll do like one high carb one and then one electrolyte one, because you do actually sweat a lot at that altitude. You don't feel it because the air is so dry. But then at a point you'll look down and be like, oh yeah, I've got salt on my nicks, you know. I have been sweating even though I haven't felt it. So for me, it took me all the way until last year. I finally did like a sweat test, which was pretty simple, but it was definitely a worthwhile investment because I realized I'm quite a heavy sweater. So that was like one thing I changed last year in terms of, before that, I would just kind of rely more on the high carb stuff, but I wasn't getting enough electrolytes in. So I kind of alternate bottles. So say 1 hour, I've got a carb bottle that has 110 grams in it. I know, all right, I've just got to get this down in this hour. And then when I'm using the electrolyte bottle, it's usually 60 to 80 grams. So I'm like, all right, I need to top up with a gel or two this hour, and try and keep on it that way. And then that way I know, like, all right, I'm basically at the maximum I can absorb. And I've sort of learnt that through trying it in training is the easiest way. And also you have to train your gut a little bit to be able to absorb that much. But I'll just basically in the month leading up have at least 1 day a week training where I'm trying to fuel at that level. And like on a higher intensity or duration ride, I'll try and replicate similar numbers, just so your stomach doesn't totally get the shock of its life when you wake up at 6 a.m. and start jamming carbs down its throat. So that's a big part.
Yeah. So how often, I mean, are you drinking, do you try and drink every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes, or do you just,
I mean, it's
very drink?
It's course dependent on where you can get it in.
Right.
So I just try and make sure I've got the bottle done before the hour ends. And ideal world, that's consistent. But sometimes you're gripped in the race and then you kind of realize 10 minutes before the hour's up that you've still got 3/4 of a bottle, and then you've got to like take time to work on it, and get through it in that 10 minutes. But yeah, ideal world, you'd be sipping constantly and just slowly get through everything and try to sort of have like a drip process. But end of the day, like the way a bike race is, like you'd love it to be ideal world, but it really is. So you have to be able to adapt. So yeah, and making sure you like account for how much time you're going to take between the aid stations, and knowing you're going to have enough liquid and fuel on board for completing those sections. So if that means that you need to take a hydration pack and a bottle to get up Columbine and back down to Twin Lakes, then like that's what you should do. Because the worst thing that can happen out there is you run out. Because then
you can't run empty because you'll never recover, right?
You can't come back.
Can't come back.
Yeah, so that's kind of the way I go about the fueling strategy, and it's definitely a race where you're going to need to fuel on your highest end. So you kind of have to, everyone is unique in what they can consume and absorb. So basically finding where that ceiling is and then committing to that level is pretty key for that race, especially the longer you're out there, the more important that becomes. Right. So that's kind of, I see that as like a big feature of the race. And then, the final piece of the puzzle, I guess, is like equipment choice. And again, this is dependent on, resources. And again, as I said, if you had to get around there on a gravel bike, you could do it. You're going to have probably a hell of a day. but like you could make it happen. So like any bike will work, but there are definitely bikes that are going to work for you better and setups that'll work for you better. So I think like tires is an important one.
Well, would you say full suspension or hardtail would be your choice?
uh, I've run both now. Last year was the first time I rode a hardtail, and I think a full suspension is probably a better bike for the course. I think that there's enough rough sections in there, and there's enough sections that you're riding with speed that you can conserve a lot of energy and maintain more speed on a full suspension. Obviously, the drawback is that it's heavier, so then you have to ride it up Columbine and then back up Powerline. But it's I think having done both, I'll this year I'm going to ride a full suspension again. That being said, it wasn't like a horrible day out on a hardtail. This is me looking for fine percentages, you know. I think the biggest thing with riding a hardtail is you just have to understand that you're on a hardtail and there are some limitations with that. And depending on like tire choice, you can get away with a pretty light, fast tire. But you have to understand that you're on a light, fast tire because there's enough chunky sections in there that you can absolutely tear a sidewall or blow that thing off the rim if you're not careful.
That's
So
for sure.
yeah, but I
So
think
what bike are you running?
this year I'm just gonna run a scalpel. Like so that's like my go-to. They have a new bike coming this year, so I think it'll be a 120 mil bike. That's not like necessary for the course, but it's nice to have travel. But yeah, typically I've run just 100 mil scalpel, and then in the end, I've tried very light, fast tires, and just haven't had luck with it. In terms of like it just takes one mistake and then you spend 5 minutes on the side of the road fixing it. So I actually just go for like the heavier casing mezcal tire, which is the one Vittoria makes, a cross country tire. That's like my go-to because I know I can push it and I know I can let the brakes go and not be, worried about tearing a sidewall or washing out. It's like a tire. Basically, it comes down to it's a tire I understand very well, and it's the tire I run when I'm at home. And so when I show up on race day, I'm like, okay, I completely understand the way this tire performs. So
Sure.
it's not
And what you can do with it, right? And you
exactly.
trust it. You trust it.
You trust it, and you know what you can't do on it. Which I think when it comes down to choosing that stuff, you should always go with what you're most comfortable with. And if you do plan on running a more aggressive tire in terms of a tire that's lighter with less tread, then you should train on that at home. So when you show up on race day, you know what that tire can and can't handle.
Right.
And so I'd say that's that, and then the gearing. Like
Gary's huge.
gearing's important, and Leadville's a tough one because there are some very slow sections and there are some really fast sections.
Right.
So you need to understand that at some point you're going to be undergeared and at some point you're going to be overgeared. It's just deciding which end of the scale you want to slide that. And I think that decision should come down to the time you think it's going to take you. Because the sections that are fast, they're over very quickly. And if you're racing at the front of the race, they're important. But if you're racing further down, it's less important. Whereas the time you spend at the top of the cassette, you know, in the smallest gear is a lot longer. So yeah, I've played around with gear choice there a lot. Last year I rode a 42, which was huge, and liked it, but you have to race fast to make that gear work.
Oh yeah.
If you come apart, then you know it's a long slog back up power line. So yeah, I think
Would
like
you run that again? Are you going to run that gearing again?
probably. I mean, at the point I'm at now, like um I just want to take big swings at this race, you know. And if I fall apart and die in the process, then so be it. But I've been on every step of the podium except the top one. So trying different things is kind of where I'm at now. But I wouldn't want to be on that gear if I was out there any longer than 6:15 or something, because
Oh yeah.
it gets hefty at the top of Columbine and back up power line. So I mean, yeah, I think like for most people racing, like a 34 or a 32 is going to be a nice choice. If you've got like a decent cassette on the back. But again, that kind of is a personal choice, but it's something that needs to be considered. And again, understanding that it's an altitude race. So if the last 100 mile you did at sea level, a certain gear felt fine, you should probably come back down a little bit from that point.
For sure.
Because the race is going to be slower. And that's just the nature of Leadville.
All right. And if you're pushing a 32 or 34 at sea level or flats,
Yeah.
when you get here, I mean, I think St. Kevin's a great barometer for that, because
Mm-hmm.
if you're a 12-hour bubble racer and you can barely make it up Kevin, or you're redlining going up Kevin, your gearing's wrong.
Yeah. It's way
You
too
got to
far.
back it down. I mean, we're talking, 30, 28s,
Exactly.
to get those people to where they can divide the load, they
Totally.
can make it up, not being burning all their matches then, and be able to get through the rest of the day.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Um, and then in terms of the strategy of the race, I think like finding your own rhythm up Kevins, and then kind of I think the goal should be by the time you come down power line, you've found your group um, of people to ride with, because from the bottom of power line to Twin Lakes, it is nice to have a group of people. It's a fast part of the course. Drafting can save you a lot, and if you can latch onto a group that is happy to roll and you can save some energy there, you're gonna like bring down your overall time and hopefully not spend any more energy. So I'd say that's one part of the race where committing to finding a group is important. And then basically you hit Twin Lakes, and it's your final kind of breather before you take on Columbine, which is a beast of a climb. You know, it's long, it's very long, and it gets progressively harder. I think a lot of people get sucked in at the bottom and you're like, oh, this is the hill. You know what I mean? You're like, this is what they talk about. You're like, it's fine. And then, you know, the trees disappear and you hit the Jeep road at the top and you're like, okay, this is what they talk about. So managing your effort well up there, and not getting sucked into thinking that the top of Columbine's the finish of the race, which is an easy one to do, because it is like the hardest maintained effort of the race, but the hardest part of the course is getting back. Even though it's technically, I guess, downhill, but it does not feel like it. So
No.
yeah, if you can manage your effort well there, and ideally come back through Twin Lakes thinking, okay, I still have some gas in the tank, and I'm going to need it to get back. Is if you can find a group, then again, great. At that point in the race, it's normally quite spread out. So you might find a partner. You might find it might be worth, if there's someone riding 200 meters behind you, it could be a smart decision to slow down, take it easy, and wait for someone to come so you can have a partner to sort of swap turns on the way back to power line. I think that's like definitely a smart decision, because anytime you give up there, you're easily going to make up with a partner, and you're going to spend less energy doing it, because they're, again, the fastest and most like open to sharing load, I think. And then basically, like, you hit the bottom of power line, and then there's no more tactic anymore. It's actually, it's a hard slog from there to the finish. And there's no easy way to do it. And I think that's when everyone in the race has come apart to a degree at that point. And it kind of, even though it's like, it's not a huge distance to the finish, but it can feel like an eternity. And it's not fun, that part, it's really not. And I think, like, mentally understanding that you're like, all right, this is what I'm here for. This is where I get to see what I'm made of. Like, when things don't feel great and every pedal stroke is like a conscious decision, and like, my legs burn, my lungs are burnt out, like, I got dirt in my eyes, all of the things that can go wrong will go wrong. And then putting it together from there to make the finish, I think, is where you like really earn your finish at Leadville. But understanding that, like, not getting, like, I think it's really easy to get there and think like, woe is me, like, my life sucks, this is horrible, what am I doing?
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sure a lot of people then lean on, like, oh, well, I've got these people here who are trying to help me, I need to finish this. And, like, sure, if you want to lean on those things, if it helps, that's great. But I think the most important thing is realizing that you're like, this is what I'm here for. If it was easy, everyone would do it. And if it was easy, I wouldn't have had to do the training. And if it was easy, it wouldn't mean anything. So, like, that's kind of the mindset I think you have to be prepared to put yourself in to get to the finish at that point, and to do it in a way that you're proud of. I think that's very important. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I guess, my insight in a nutshell. I don't know if you have any, like, specific questions, but yeah, it's a hell of a race that deserves respect. And I think, like, yeah, if you've got that email saying that you're going, then the time is now to start preparing. Because the earlier you start your homework, the less that day is going to suck.
Right. Yeah. I've always said you cannot cram for this test.
No,
This is one test you cannot cram for.
no, you
You got to
can't.
start early and stick with it. And
You
I guess
can't.
a couple questions would be, dropper or no dropper for you? Sounds like you're dropper, but would for the less experienced racer,
I would
or
race a dropper. I would always recommend a dropper on a mountain bike. I think, like, one, you're going to be able to ride those sections quicker than you otherwise would. You're going to be able to do it more safely. I think there's a lot of, especially once you start to get two-way traffic, the technical sections can become even more so, because sometimes you're not able to choose, like, ideal line, and I think that for the amount of weight that a dropper adds, the energy you save is paid back, and more so, because you're more comfortable in those sections, you're able to ride them quicker, and there's just less risk. So I think a dropper is probably the way to go for majority of people. I think if you're like an elite level racer who comes from a mountain biking background, and you want to shave that weight, then it's definitely a course that's totally rideable, with a stiff post. But it's sort of it's why not run it, I think. So and then yeah, like again, if you have never used one and you're more than comfortable not using one, then sure, have at it. But
Go with what you know.
yeah, I mean, like, and I did last year. I spent the whole month in Leadville before the race, kind of dissecting the different parts of the course, and I did it all on multiple setups, like with a stiff post and not. And end of the day, I just like to run the dropper. It was, and I was happy with that decision.
Oh, nice. Are you a bottle guy or a pack guy? You got to be a bottle guy, right?
Yeah, bottle. I think that there are some sections where a pack could be useful. I think if you're less confident on a mountain bike, a pack is good because you're going to be able to drink a lot easier and keep the hands on the bars, and sort of have that stress of finding where to drink sort of negated. But I think, like, again, that's a very kind of personal choice. I just prefer the bottles, because it works out really well on that course in terms of timing with aid stations, and you can sort of get the bottle you need, and then by the time you're done, you get the next bottle, and it sort of works very, very well in that way. But again, a pack it's not a bad option. I think especially early on when it's not warm. So like it's cold in the beginning. And I think like that's where you can definitely get away with the pack. For me, it's just like it's more like a heat thing. So when you're running really hot, I don't want any more extra layers on me, I guess is the comes down to for me. But it's a very personal choice, I think. It's like both work fine on that course.
Right. Do you ever have your hands ever go numb?
Not during that race. I mean, I've done enough ultras now to where I can't really feel these two fingers anyway, even now. But I've had enough nerve damage.
Oh man.
But I think if that's something that you notice at all in training, then it's really going to come out in the race. So like the ergonomic grips are great for that. They definitely help. I've also used I used bar ends last year, which like old school, but it's nice to have another hand position, I think. And the more you can kind of alternate where your hands sit, on the flatter sections, I kind of hold on to where the brake levers are, like away from the brakes, I guess, but just it gives you another hand spot. But
He's talking narrower, right?
yeah, exactly. Narrower, it's a bit more aerodynamic, obviously, but it's also like just helps shift where your weight is and kind of even it out over a day. So I think that's like that can help with that if it's something you struggle with. And then if it's like, I think if it's really excessive, then you need to modify like your position a little bit, like potentially coming a bit lower in the saddle and further back just to kind of move that weight off the hands. But it's kind of like again, like a personal one. But yeah, I think if your bike fit is good and you're comfortable off road, I think a lot of people, they don't realize that they're holding onto the bars like 10 times harder than they need to be. Like
Right.
all the first mountain bike races I did, like the biggest complaint at the end, I was like, oh, my hands, and it's because I've literally just been hanging on for dear life, you know. Like I could sit here and just squeeze my fists, and if I had to do that for 6 hours, then yeah, my hand's probably going to go numb. So like, yeah, a good consideration, I think for sure.
Uh, do you do, as far as bike fit goes, do you have a place that you go, and if so, do you revisit that once a year? Do you just, hey, I did it once, I know where everything needs to be and I'm good? How do you manage the bike fit piece?
Yeah, I work with Ivan Gorman in Boulder, or he's just outside of Boulder in Niwot. He has a studio there, and I've I've always dialed in my fits with him since probably 10 years now, which is helpful because I think you end up with like a good catalog of like where your position's been, and then as you shift bikes, you can kind of say, oh, identify. I feel like this bike's this. I can check it, and then I'm very like, I notice like small things on my bike, so I'm like a fiddler for sure. And then I do change bike setups dependent on course, which I mean, I wouldn't recommend someone changes their fit, dramatically before Leadville, but I think like the most important is having a fit you're comfortable with. And if you spend 90% of the time riding on the road, preparing for an event like this, then you probably want a position on the mountain bike that reflects that, you know, because your body is going to be efficient in working in that way. So
Train.
exactly. So I think you can see it, especially in the elite field, with people who don't spend a lot of time on the mountain bike, and they're not as good in that position. Like people who might be able to climb with you on a road bike or on a gravel bike, they get on a mountain bike and they can't put it together in the same way. And I think that comes down to not spending enough time on the bike, and then not having the position that reflects what their body's used to. But
Wow, it's interesting.
mm,
Super cool. Never, I never thought about that, but that makes total sense. If you're just
yeah, and
used
I
to.
mean, there's a lot of considerations with a mountain bike fit if you're new to it. Like your feet are wider, and the way the bikes are set up, the seat angles are steeper. So if you run your saddle in the middle of the rails on a road bike, and then you run your saddle in the middle of the rails on a mountain bike, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be 3 to 4 centimeters further forward than you normally are, right? Which means you're probably going to be a bit more quad dominant, and you're using muscles in a different. Well, you're not using them in a different way, but you're shifting the load in a different way. So muscles that aren't used to getting that much abuse are going to get more abuse. So it's worth taking time to set your bike up, and then doing your training in that position so everything feels good on race day, is important.
Wow, very cool. And you're running a 42 again this year?
Yeah, a 40 or a 42. I think like the racing's getting faster. And Keegan was on a 40 last year. I was on a 42, and there was a significant section of the course where we were the only two guys who could pedal out there, because we were going that quick. So I think like, it's gonna to win that race for the foreseeable future. I think it's gonna require another record. So like, yeah, I think bigger gears are going to be a big part of that.
Wow. So what's your prediction for 2024? Your time?
Time, I mean, I think with the right group of riders, like last year, I knew Keegan was going for a record, and I was sort of also like buying into that in terms of like I wanted to keep the pace moving, because I wanted to be there if I could be, but I flooded very early on and had to come back 2 minutes. I was already sort of a bit toasted. So it was basically him and I keeping the pace moving all the way to Twin Lakes, which we did a good pace. But if you had that whole group of 10 riders committed, there's like another couple of minutes to be made there. Like I don't know how much faster you could go up the hill than Keegan did, but you never say never with him. So there's definitely, I'm sure, time to be made out there. Whether or not you'll see, I mean, I'll be interested to see if Keegan comes at it with the same mentality of like, all right, I'm trying to break a record. Takes a special athlete, but I think like probably you'll see him go faster again. Or someone else is going to step up and be able to ride with him, and then that'll make he rode the whole thing back by himself. So if you had another few riders who could climb with him, then you're going to see it go faster again. So, and I think like the the rate at which the competitive scene in off-road racing is growing. You're seeing more and more athletes like come out of the road or out of elite mountain biking, and not just at the end of their career, but also while they're still kind of in their prime, sort of jumping into it. So that is just going to raise the bar, competitively. So it's just going to require more and more to win events like that. So yeah, I'd love to see Sepp Kuss come and race it. I think he's someone who could do something special on that course, if he had the time to do his homework. Yeah, there's no one out there currently that I can think of that could match Keegan on that course. Although, there's going to be a bunch of us try, so you never say never, right?
Never say never.
Yeah.
It's a long day, man. Anything can happen.
Anything can happen. For sure.
Holy cow. Well, I can't thank you enough to taking the time to share your experience, share your your knowledge, and hopefully you can, some of the first timers or the the people who have done it a couple times and still haven't buckled can kind of put some pieces of the puzzle together and make a better attempt.
No, I mean, as I said, it's a race that you can do 10 times and still learn something, right? So I think like any little tidbits definitely help. So I hope that there's something in there for people. But I think going full circle on it, like the day is just kind of the end result of like a journey of getting ready for it. So I think like the biggest thing is you have to have a process that it's going to get you there ready, but you're going to be able to enjoy that process, because that period of time is a lot longer than
Race day.
Right. So you need to enjoy that experience in getting ready for the race. So finding ways to make it fun, as well as prepare your body is kind of, I think, crucial.
Right, because you're going to dedicate a lot of your life to it.
Exactly.
So, make it a good, fun journey that you're going to look back and be happy you did it, instead of being regretful that whatever you did wasn't right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, what an interview. Holy cow. What a story and what a bunch of information. So I hope you guys picked up on a bunch of things and are going to be able to, put those into play for a successful Leadville 2024. So Lachlan, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Best of luck
Thank you.
540 for you this year.
Yeah, we'll see. I need a 44 for that.
Oh man. All right. Well, thanks again. We'll see you in Leadville, man.
Cheers. Yeah. Thank you for the chat.
Cheers.
Bye.